Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The rain had been falling steadily that night, soft, persistent, the kind that crept into your bones. Tia stood alone by the window of the hospital corridor, her hands wrapped tightly around her stomach like something was trying to break out from within. She was barely 24, with a child barely walking, and a husband who had just stopped breathing. The nurses whispered politely, the doctor offered soft condolences, but none of it sank in. Tia's eyes remained fixed on the wet glass. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared. There was no mother to call, no father to lean on. Her husband's family had done enough by paying for the hospital bill. Now, the silence that wrapped around her was thicker than grief. It was the beginning of a loneliness she hadn't yet understood. The little girl in the cot beside her stirred, whimpering in her sleep, but Tia didn't move. In the months that followed, Tia's flat grew quieter. She sold her husband's few belongings. His wristwatch, his 2 suits, even his Bluetooth speaker that he had once insisted made his evenings feel rich. Emily, her daughter, grew quietly too. She didn't fuss much, didn't cry too loud, didn't demand more than Tia could offer. But that calmness only made things harder. Every time Tia looked at her daughter, she felt the weight of everything she had lost. The food was never enough, and the nights felt longer when Emily had a fever and Tia had to walk to a neighbor's to borrow paracetamol. She tried jobs, selling clothes, helping in a friend's shop, even cleaning once for a rich lady who gave her only old shoes as payment. But no matter what she did, motherhood always felt too big for her shoulders. And so, she began to slip into a rhythm. If there was someone to watch Emily, she let them. Friends, cousins, neighbors, it didn't matter. As long as the girl was safe and fed, Tia could breathe. By the time Emily turned 5, Tia had developed the habit fully, dropping her daughter with whoever seemed responsible and willing. One of those people was her younger sister, Ronia, who lived on the other side of town in a cramped but cheerful apartment with her own son, Mark. Ronia didn't have much, but she had patience. She would braid Emily's hair in the evenings, pack their school lunches, and teach both children how to spell their names with chalk on the back wall of her kitchen. Emily began to look forward to the holidays not because school was out, but because she would get to stay with her auntie. Tia, on the other hand, would often visit Ronia's house dressed in new shoes and fresh braids, borrowed or bought with money no one asked too many questions about. She would flash a tired smile, ask for the dress hanging by the window, and leave before evening. To her, it was just a phase. To Emily, it was the start of something else, a quiet rearranging of what family truly meant. Emily sat on the edge of the low wooden bench in Ronia's compound, her legs swinging gently as she watched Mark chase a worn rubber ball across the patchy concrete. The sun was gentle that morning, filtered through rustling mango leaves above. Ronia's radio crackled from the open kitchen window, an old gospel tune rising and falling with the wind. There was a rhythm to life in her auntie's house that felt nothing like the half-empty flat where her mother lived. Here mornings began with the hiss of frying oil and the smell of oji and dakara. Afternoons carried the laughter of children, the creak of the gate when the neighbors peeked in, and Ronia's voice calling out instructions or telling stories as she stirred the soup pot. Emily had begun to memorize the sounds of this place, the way Mark giggled when he was tickled, the slam of the back door when the wind caught it, the sigh Ronia let out whenever she folded laundry on Sunday evenings. These things, small as they were, filled her in ways she didn't know she needed. Tia didn't visit often, but when she did, it was like a breeze that didn't stay long enough to cool the room. She would come in with a plastic bag of shoes or sit briefly on the edge of the bed, asking questions that never waited for answers. She called Emily my daughter with a smile, but the words often hung in the air like they weren't sure where they belonged. Emily never asked when her mother would take her home again. She had stopped wondering. Holidays bled into school terms, and when it was time to resume, Romeo would quietly register her in the nearby public school along with Mark. There were no formal arrangements, just a growing understanding that Emily lived here now, even if no one had said it out loud. Once, when Mark scraped his knee and cried, Ronia cleaned it and held him, then pulled Emily close too and kissed both foreheads in the same motion. That small act clung to Emily's memory like a ribbon tied tightly around her chest. As the years drifted forward, the bond between the children deepened like roots in quiet soil. They became inseparable, doing homework side by side, trading stories about their classmates, and sharing spoonfuls of beans straight from the pot when they thought Ronia wasn't looking. Ronia raised them like twins from different mothers, correcting them with equal firmness, loving them with equal heart. Emily, though quiet by nature, became observant. She noticed how her auntie would come home tired from work, but still prepared dinner with care, or how she always ensured there was meat in both plates, even when she barely served herself. Sometimes at night, when the house was still, Emily would lie awake and stare at the ceiling, wondering why some mothers stayed tired but present, while others drifted in and out like a flickering light bulb. Yet she never voiced these thoughts. She simply held them. And with each passing day, they grew into quiet truths buried deep within her, shaping the kind of love and disappointment she would one day learn to name. It was a warm afternoon, the kind where the air clung lazily to the skin, and the scent of dust mixed with the distant smoke of burning firewood. Emily and Mark were in the front yard, crouched beside a line of bottle caps arranged like soldiers. They had invented a game, one that involved flicking the caps with small stones, counting points, and laughing loudly at each miss. Ronia's voice floated from inside the house as she hummed while peeling yam for dinner. Then the metal latch on the gate clicked. Emily looked up first. Tia walked in, dressed in tight jeans and a yellow blouse with wide sleeves. Her braids were fresh, cascading over her shoulders, and her lips were glossed to a soft shine. She didn't greet immediately. Instead, she stood for a moment watching the children play. Then, almost as if an idea bloomed suddenly, she smiled and said to Mark, "I came to pick Emily. School is resuming soon." Mark nodded, brushing dust off his shorts. Tia tilted her head, her voice almost playful. "But Mark, would you like it if Emily went to your school? Both of you together?" Mark blinked, surprised, then grinned. "Yes, Auntie," he said, then bolted into the house to tell his mother, just like she had hoped he would. Inside, Ronia paused in the middle of slicing yam. Mark burst into the kitchen breathlessly, sharing what his auntie had said. Ronia turned, wiping her hands on her wrapper, her brow furrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in contemplation. Tia strolled in behind Mark, her tone sweet but a bit too light. "I was thinking," she said casually, "maybe Emily can go to the same school with Mark this term. They play together, they get along. It'll be good for her." She reached for a cup of water like she was just visiting, not placing responsibility in someone else's lap. Ronia looked at Emily, who was now standing by the door, eyes expectant but unsure. "Emily," Ronia said gently, "do you want to go to school with your cousin?" Emily nodded quickly, almost shyly, her fingers tugging at the hem of her shirt. That small gesture, quiet and sincere, was all Ronia needed. She gave a tired smile and said, "Okay, we'll sort it out." Tia clapped softly, beaming, then quickly changed the subject, asking if she could borrow Ronia's handbag for a wedding that weekend. Ronia didn't answer immediately. She just turned back to the yam and continued peeling. Later that evening, after Tia had left with the handbag and a pair of Ronia's shoes in her plastic bag, Emily sat on the edge of her mattress, her eyes following the pattern of cracks in the wall. She was still thinking about the conversation in the kitchen, how her mother had made it seem like an idea just born from love and spontaneity. But even as a child, she knew there was something about the way Tia had said it, something rehearsed beneath the smile. Ronia, meanwhile, stood at the window, staring out at the night, her thoughts heavy. She hadn't asked for this, but she also couldn't say no. Emily had become hers, not by blood, but by bond, and bonds like that weren't chosen. They simply happened. She knew that once school started again, she would be paying for 2 uniforms, 2 sets of books, 2 lunchboxes. She didn't have the money, but she would find a way. Somehow, she always did. By the time the new school session began, Emily wore the same uniform as Mark, a light blue shirt with short sleeves and a deep navy pinafore that hugged her slender frame. The fabric was slightly oversized, with sleeves that drooped and a hem that stopped awkwardly at her shins, but it was hers. Ronia had bought both uniforms from a roadside trader after bargaining in the sun for nearly an hour. Emily didn't complain. She never did. She stood in front of the mirror that first morning and ran her fingers down the pinafore, as though smoothing her gratitude into the seams. Mark, already dressed and fidgeting with his socks, shouted from the sitting room that they'd be late. When they finally left the house, their footsteps echoed side by side along the cracked pavement, their lunchboxes swinging in rhythm. Ronia stood at the doorway watching them until they disappeared around the bend, her arms folded across her chest, and her heart pulled in 2 directions, pride and worry. She had stretched herself to afford the term's expenses, and it showed in the way she now rationed food more carefully and stitched old wrappers into curtains instead of buying new ones. Tia didn't return for weeks. There were no calls, no messages, just silence. Not that Ronia expected anything different. She was used to the pattern by now. The borrowed shoes and handbags wouldn't come back either. They never did. What came instead were bills, school contributions, excursion forms, pencils that disappeared overnight, and soap that finished faster because there were now 2 heads bathing before dawn. Emily, however, never asked for more than what was given. She shared everything with Mark, biscuits, notebooks, even secrets. Ronia once overheard them whispering in the dark about a girl in their class who brought boiled eggs to school every day, and how one day they too would be able to afford that. Emily's laughter was soft, but it lingered in the air, warming the room like sunlight through torn curtains. On some nights, Ronia would sit by the window, counting her remaining Naira notes, wondering how long she could keep this up. Yet the sight of Emily curled beside Mark, her arm draped loosely over his back as they slept, always convinced her that she could push a little further. One Saturday, while washing clothes at the back of the house, Ronia noticed Emily kneeling beside the basin with a piece of soap in her hand. Her small palms rubbed the socks together with careful effort. "You don't have to do that, my dear," Ronia said, rinsing out a wrapper and wringing it tightly. Emily looked up with a faint smile. "I want to help." It wasn't the first time she had said that. Emily had started to sweep the house without being told, pack Mark's books before school, and sit beside her auntie while she cooked, watching closely as she added salt and stirred soups in wide, shallow pots. It was as though she had decided, in her own quiet way, to ease the weight that Ronia carried. Ronia felt it. She didn't speak on it often, but she noticed every act. And in those moments, when Emily hummed to herself while peeling beans or folded dry clothes without instruction, something stirred gently in Ronia's chest, an affection rooted not in duty, but in choice. Emily had begun to grow into something Ronia couldn't name yet, but it felt sacred, like being trusted with a fragile treasure that once belonged to someone careless. The end of secondary school came quietly, like the last page of a long book that no one was ready to close. Emily had passed her WAEC exams with strong results, better than most in her class, even better than Mark, who beamed with pride when their results came in. Ronia had hugged both of them tightly that evening, pressing their foreheads to hers one after the other as tears welled in her eyes. She'd managed to raise 2 children under one roof, and neither had fallen through the cracks. The weeks that followed were filled with conversations about what next, university, job training, maybe travel. Ronia started to ask quiet questions around her office, speaking to colleagues who had children abroad. She listened with intent when someone mentioned the student visa process. It was Mark who brought the idea up at first, casually saying one afternoon, "I heard Chuka is going to the States for school." That name lingered in Ronia's mind, and slowly it turned into a seed. The decision to send Mark abroad was not a bold announcement. It was a quiet resolve. Ronia didn't share her plans with anyone at first, not even the children. She started saving aggressively, eating less, skipping transport to walk longer distances. The car that once helped her manage work and market errands was sold. She told people she was tired of the repairs, but in truth, the money was for the visa application fees. Still, it wasn't enough. The land her late father had left to both sisters was the next thing to go. She sold her half through a distant uncle, avoiding any direct involvement with Tia, who hadn't stepped foot in her compound in months. When Mark finally got his admission letter and visa approval, Ronia sat in the bathroom for over an hour, her legs tucked under her, the paper pressed to her chest. She had done it. No fanfare, no ceremony. Just sweat, sacrifice, and the kind of love that moved quietly beneath the surface. Emily stood at the airport beside Ronia as they watched Mark disappear through the departure gates, his backpack bouncing slightly with each step. She waved and smiled, but her hand trembled. For the first time in years, the house would feel half full. That evening, the silence in the room was different. Emily sat by the window, her face pressed to the glass, the lights of passing cars flickering against her cheeks. She didn't say much. And Ronia, who had always known how to read her, said nothing either. Instead, she made Emily's favorite yam porridge and placed it quietly on the table. A few days later, as if summoned by the scent of change, Tia appeared. She didn't greet with excitement or ask about Mark. She sat on the edge of the couch and said, "I've been thinking, Emily should join Mark in the U.S. too. It's only fair." The words came like a splash of cold water. Ronia blinked, unsure whether to laugh or curse. There was no, "How have you been?" No offer of help. Just a new demand wrapped in maternal entitlement. Emily's eyes flicked from her mother to her auntie, her heart sinking. She understood in that moment that history was about to repeat itself, only this time it would cost more than bags or borrowed shoes. The air inside Ronia's room grew still after Tia left that day, her request hanging like smoke that refused to clear. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, slowly folding her laundry, but her fingers had stilled. She stared at the neat pile in front of her, lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to speak, but had lost the words somewhere between her heart and her throat. Ronia didn't say anything. She moved quietly, picking up a broom, sweeping the corners of the room that were already clean. Her mind was loud, a storm of thoughts colliding. Rent was due soon, her savings were gone, and Mark's departure had already stripped her walls bare. Yet the image of Emily in a departure lounge, backpack clutched tightly, filled her chest with both fear and pride. She thought of how the girl had grown, how she no longer needed to be told to close the windows when it rained or count change at the market. Emily had become hers in every way except on paper, and now to let her go felt like peeling skin off bone. But Ronia knew, she always knew, that the love she gave was never about possession. It was about giving roots and then wings. In the following weeks, Ronia moved like someone in a trance. She woke earlier, came home later, and spoke less. At her workplace, she inquired about second-hand laptops and asked quiet questions about agents who handled student visas. Her name spread from one table to another, eventually reaching a friend of a friend who connected her with a travel consultant. The fees were staggering. Her chest tightened when she saw the figures, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she began the familiar routine of subtraction. One wrapper sold here, a borrowed contribution there. One night, she took out a small envelope from the bottom drawer of her cupboard, the one where she kept her late mother's old earrings and slid the gold studs into a pouch. At the jewelry shop, she didn't haggle. She simply waited for the cash and walked out into the noisy market with her dignity tied to the inside of her wrapper. She never told Emily the full extent of what she sold. Some things were better carried alone. Emily noticed, of course, the missing pots, the sudden silence during dinner, but she said nothing. Instead, she began staying up later, helping with house chores, and studying the American school curriculum on her phone in the dark. When the visa was finally approved, Ronia didn't cry, not immediately. She held the document in her palm, turned it over once, then placed it on the table like something fragile. Emily stood nearby, eyes wide, not quite smiling, not quite ready. The next few days moved in a blur. Neighbors came to greet and pray, offering envelopes with small notes and 1,000 God will bless you wishes. The morning of her flight, Emily wore a white blouse tucked neatly into blue jeans, her braids tied back. At the airport, Ronia held her hand tightly until the last boarding call. "Thank you," Emily whispered just before she turned to leave. Her voice cracked, but her back stayed straight. Ronia watched her walk away, her lips trembling. She whispered a prayer without sound, asking God not to let the child forget where her real home began. When Emily disappeared through the gate, Ronia stood still, not blinking, until her legs ached. Then she turned and walked back to the car park, her bag light but her heart heavier than it had ever been. 2 years passed like the slow turn of pages in an old novel, quiet, steady, filled with days that blurred together. Emily stayed in touch as best she could, calling every Sunday, sending short voice notes between classes, and forwarding pictures of snow-covered sidewalks and her tiny apartment room decorated with sticky notes and second-hand textbooks. Ronia saved every photo. She printed some and taped them on the edge of her wardrobe, a small gallery of pride. Tia, on the other hand, shared the same pictures with friends in church and at her hair salon, often with an air of ownership. "My daughter," she would say, as if the sacrifices had been hers. When Emily mentioned she would be visiting Nigeria during her summer break, it was Tia who told the neighbors first. She began preparing weeks in advance, sewing 2 new dresses, repainting her sitting room, and rehearsing how she would pose when Emily arrived. But Emily didn't go straight to her mother's house. She came quietly to Ronia's, suitcase in hand, eyes tired but bright. She hugged her auntie with both arms and didn't let go for a long time. That evening, she sat cross-legged in the kitchen, peeling a goosey beside Ronia, humming a tune neither of them had heard in years. Days turned into a week. Emily moved gently through the house as if reacquainting herself with old memories, touching the kitchen stool where she used to sit to do homework, brushing her fingers along the curtain, seams she had once hemmed with needle and thread. She had returned with more than stories. Her suitcases carried clothes, books, chocolates, and carefully wrapped boxes marked with names, for Auntie Ronia, for Mark, for Mom. Tia arrived on the 4th day of Emily's visit, unannounced, her voice trailing in before her body entered. "My daughter," she cried, wrapping Emily in an embrace that left no space for breath. Her eyes darted quickly to the boxes. She wasted no time rifling through them, holding up a purse and a silk scarf, asking if this was hers or her sister's. Emily tried to stay polite, tried not to wince when her mother claimed the box meant for Ronia, insisting it didn't matter who it was addressed to. Ronia watched the exchange silently, her hands folded, her mouth pressed in a line. Later that night, when the compound was quiet and the lights were out, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan. Something in her had shifted, some tether had loosened, and the weight of gratitude she once carried for her mother now sat in an awkward corner of her chest. The idea came to her on a Monday morning. It was Ronia's birthday, and the house had the soft scent of rice and fried meat. Emily disappeared for a few hours and returned with a thin smile and a red ribbon in her hand. Everyone gathered outside, neighbors, two co-workers of Ronia's, a boy from the local church, and watched as Emily led her auntie toward the gate. Parked just beyond was a sleek silver sedan, brand new, its windows still covered in protective plastic. Gasps filled the air. Ronia froze, her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. "This is yours," Emily said simply, holding out the keys. "For everything." Ronia couldn't speak. She cried quietly, nodding, her voice lodged somewhere deep inside. But the celebration didn't last long. Tia, who had arrived late, stood near the door, her expression stiff. Her arms remained folded as she watched people surround Ronia with hugs and blessings. Then, suddenly, her voice broke the laughter. "So, you bought a car for your auntie," she said, sharp and loud, "and not for your own mother?" The compound fell silent. Emily's jaw tightened. Before she could respond, Tia added, "That car better be in my compound before I get home. If not, you'll see." And with that, she stormed off, dragging the weight of entitlement behind her, leaving only shame and confusion in her place. The compound stayed unusually quiet after Tia's outburst. The laughter had died mid-breath, and the guests, neighbors who had come to celebrate, slowly found excuses to leave. Someone dropped their plastic plate in a rush, the rice spilling onto the ground like a quiet apology. Ronia stood frozen by the gate, still holding the car key in her palm. Her birthday blouse, a soft lilac lace she had only worn once before, suddenly felt too tight. Emily had gone back inside without a word. She sat on the edge of the sofa, her eyes unfocused, her back rigid. The silence in the living room wasn't heavy with anger. It was soaked in humiliation. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Ronia entered slowly, her eyes lowered, her voice hushed. "I didn't expect that," she said. Emily looked up, her voice strained but steady. "Neither did I, but I should have." There was no shouting between them. Just the ache of a moment that should have been joyful, now buried under years of tension neither woman had ever dared to name out loud. By morning, the car had been driven to Tia's compound. Not by Emily, but by a mechanic hired by Ronia, who wanted no further drama. The gesture was quiet but clear, peace over pride. Emily didn't speak to her mother that day, nor the day after. She moved around the house like someone rearranging furniture in a room she wasn't sure she'd sleep in again. Ronia, though heartbroken, never tried to stop the car from leaving. She simply returned to her small routines, sweeping the corridor, boiling yam, turning off the generator when fuel got low. The hurt showed in her face, in the lines under her eyes, in the way her shoulders drooped when she bent over the wash basin. But she never said anything bad about Tia. She only said, "She is who she is." Emily, meanwhile, grew distant. She spent hours in her room, making international calls and pacing slowly. Sometimes Ronia would catch her standing still in the kitchen, holding a spoon mid-air, her mind somewhere far. One evening, Ronia walked in to find Emily staring at the wall with an open laptop in front of her and a design plan on the screen. She didn't ask questions. She just sat beside her and waited. The night before her flight back to the U.S., Emily finally broke the silence. She called both women into the sitting room, though only Ronia came. Tia was absent, still sulking from the car situation, sending curt messages but no presence. Emily inhaled deeply and looked at her auntie, her voice trembling with restraint. "I was building something," she began. "A house." Quietly. "It was meant for my mother. I wanted her to have something to show for being my mom." Ronia blinked, unsure if she should speak. Emily continued. "But after what happened, I realized I was building it for the wrong person." Her voice caught, but she pushed through. "You gave me everything, Auntie. And I didn't even come from your body. You didn't ask for anything. You just gave." Then she placed a folder on the table. Inside were the land documents and architect sketches for a bungalow, already started, foundation laid. "It's yours now," she said. Ronia covered her face with her hands, crying softly, not from the gift, but from the weight of being seen. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the car, not the arguments. Just the quiet truth that love, when rooted in sacrifice, blooms in places you least expect. The morning sun filtered softly through the sitting room curtains, casting long shadows across the tiled floor. Emily sat at the small dining table, slowly sipping from a glass of warm tea, her travel bag zipped and resting by the door. Her flight was in a few hours, but the weight she carried was not in her luggage. It pressed heavily against her chest. Ronia moved quietly in the background, tidying dishes that were already clean, refolding a wrapper that hadn't been touched. Neither of them spoke much. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but filled with thoughts they were afraid to say out loud. Suddenly, the metal gate clanged open, and the familiar sound of heels clicking against the cement floor echoed toward the house. Tia entered unannounced, lips pursed, eyes surveying the room like she was walking into a meeting where she had already made up her mind. She didn't greet Ronia, her eyes fixed on Emily. "You're going back to that country today, ABI? Good. But pack your things and come to my house. You've stayed here long enough." Her voice was sharp, as though correcting a child. Emily didn't flinch. She placed her cup gently on the table and rose. The calm in her face made the room feel smaller. "Come with me?" she repeated slowly. "To your house." She let out a short breath that almost sounded like laughter. "Mummy, I was 6 when I realized you never wanted to carry me. Not physically, not emotionally. You left me with people like I was luggage, like I was always one errand away from being someone else's responsibility." Tia opened her mouth to speak, but Emily raised a hand. "You want me now, because I came back with boxes and dollars. But when I needed paracetamol, Auntie Ronia walked to the chemist. When I had fever, she stayed up fanning me with a Bible. She sold her car, sold her land, just so I could become something. And what did you sell?" Her voice cracked on the last word, not from rage, but disappointment. "What have you ever really given me, apart from shame and borrowed things you never returned?" The room fell into stillness. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to pause. Ronia stood still, her hand resting gently on the edge of a chair, her eyes wet but steady. Tia's expression twisted, offense struggling with the guilt that bloomed in the edges of her eyes. "So now you're giving her everything?" she asked, her voice brittle. "Even the house?" Emily nodded slowly. "Yes, I was going to build it for you. I truly was. But now I realize the foundation was never meant for you." Tia's hand shook, and she looked at her sister for help, but Ronia said nothing. She had learned not to interrupt consequences when they finally arrived. "Take the car," Emily said finally, "if it matters that much, but you will never take what I've built with my heart." With that, she picked up her bag, kissed her auntie's forehead, and walked out. Tia watched her go, the sound of the door closing behind her like a final note. Left in the silence, she sat down slowly, the weight of absence settling into the chair beside her. The house stood quietly at the end of the unpaved street, its freshly plastered walls still smelling faintly of cement, its green roof glistening from the last morning rain. A narrow footpath led from the gate to the front door, bordered on each side by young hibiscus plants Emily had asked the builder to include. Inside, the scent of new paint mixed with the warmth of something older, something lived in. Ronia stood at the threshold that evening, barefoot, a simple wrapper tied around her waist, her arms folded lightly. She didn't step in immediately. Instead, she looked around slowly, drinking in every detail, the soft cream tiles, the carved wooden doorframe, the sunlight pooling beneath the living room window. A small plaque hung on the wall just inside the corridor, for the one who never let go. She didn't cry this time. The tears had come and gone in waves during the past few days. This moment was different. It felt like finally standing inside a promise that had taken years to unfold. Word had spread in the neighborhood, not just about the house, but about the story behind it. People greeted Ronia with a different tone now, not out of envy, but something closer to reverence. Market women who once gossiped about her tight purse now pressed extra onions into her basket. Children from the church came around on Saturdays to sweep the compound without being asked. But for Ronia, none of it mattered as much as the quiet that now lived within her. In the evenings, she would sit on the small front porch with a cup of hot tea, watching the street turn gold in the lowering sun. She kept Emily's photos in a small wooden frame by the television, alongside a note written in her daughter's handwriting, "Auntie, everything I am, I owe to you." Ronia would read that note sometimes without opening the paper. She had memorized the words, but what moved her more was the feeling that, finally, something in the universe had acknowledged the sacrifices she made, not loudly, not for show, but with grace. Tia did not visit. In the weeks after Emily's return to the U.S., she sent a few voice notes, some laced with apology, others steeped in denial. But Ronia never replied. She didn't need to. Her silence was no longer bitterness. It had matured into clarity. Tia still had the car, and perhaps that was fitting. Some people would always choose noise over depth, performance over presence. Emily called regularly, now with less guilt and more ease. Her laughter over the phone had changed, less cautious, more free. She spoke of new projects, new friends, and a scholarship offer that she might accept. Sometimes they spoke for hours. Other times they simply listened to each other breathe, like mother and daughter who had finally found the rhythm of their hearts beating in sync. And on one quiet Sunday afternoon, as the birds rustled softly in the trees, Ronia leaned back in her chair and whispered to herself, "I didn't birth her, but God made her mine." And in that quiet, everything felt whole. Sometimes, the people who raise us aren't the ones who gave us life. They're the ones who showed up when no one else did. Love isn't always loud or decorated with titles. Often, it's wrapped in small, quiet sacrifices, packed school lunches, shared beds, late-night prayers whispered over sleeping children. If someone in your life has carried you without seeking praise, take a moment to honor them. And if you are the one doing the carrying, don't lose heart. Your love is building something deeper than words, a legacy that will speak long after you stop talking. Never measure your worth by how loudly the world claps for you. Measure it by the depth of the lives you've shaped. Thank you for the silent givers, the ones who love without spotlight, who give without asking for return. Bless every heart that has carried another in seasons of lack, pain, or loneliness. For the aunties who became mothers, for the siblings who stepped in, for the strangers who turned into family lord, let their sacrifices speak louder than any title. Where there has been delay, let there be reward. Where there has been sorrow, let joy rise like the morning sun. Where they've been overlooked, let honor find them in unexpected ways. And for the children rising through broken beginnings, give them strength to become more than what they came from. May healing come where there was hurt. May reconciliation come where there was distance. And when the world fails to say thank you, may heaven shout it on their behalf. In Jesus' name we pray, Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.